I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. This is your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you our 40th episode. Yes, 40 episodes. So, I know some other people that do podcasts. So there's this one guy who's sought after as a podcast interviewee on a lot of things. He's kind of a big dude. And he's got this line of demarcation as to what podcasts he will and won't do. And he says that he won't do a podcast in less than its 7th episode because most podcasts don't make it up to 7 episodes. They kind of peter out before they ever get to that point and become nothing. And he's a big enough guy where it's not worth this time. But now Smart Drug Smarts is up to 40 episodes. So this particular dude has nothing to do with Smart Drugs, so he probably won't be on this podcast anyway. But anyway, I just kind of... It made me feel good to hear that because, we're 40 episodes in. We're an established kind of sort of thing now and feel like doing a little bit of self-congratulatory backslapping, but I'll cut myself off. In celebration of this 40th episode, we're going to kind of mix it up and do something different with the format. Instead of having a traditional interview, as is our standard offering, I'm going to have a conversation with 2 other people that are in the smart drugs world. And it's just kind of going to be a 3-way conversation. We're going to kick things around and talk about what's going on in the world of nootropics. Now, who are these people, you might be wondering? And it's a very legitimate question. One of them is Mike Miniman from smarternootropics.com. He's a friend of mine who lives in Los Angeles, California, a city that I know well and love. And the other is Mons Denton, who is a blogger who runs thehackedmind.com and is also a retailer in the nootropics world with a company called purenootropics.net. So we're going to kind of kick around the state of the smart drugs in society nowadays in June of 2014 and sort of our take on where things are and where they're going. And if you hang around until the end of the episode, I'm going to give you a little bit of a flashback to this guy was sent to me as like the original smart drugs user, although that's very far from the truth. I think there are people that have been doing things for mental cognition enhancement for a very, very long time. But this is a mathematician from the 20th century who you might not have heard of, but is definitely can be considered a brain hacking enthusiast. We'll tell you about him in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But before we get to any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
Researchers at Oxford University have identified an area in the human brain that appears to be unlike anything in the brains of some of our closest biological relatives. So there's an area called the ventrolateral frontal cortex in the brain, and it's involved in many of the highest aspects of cognition and language, and is only present in humans and other primates. Scientists at Oxford recently did a sort of a detailed mapping of the areas within this part of the brain. Professor Rushworth of Oxford explains the brain is a mosaic of interlinked areas. We wanted to look at this very important region of the frontal part of the brain and see how many tiles there are and where they are placed. They looked at MRI data from 25 human adult volunteers and 25 macaque monkeys and developed an MRI-based mapping of this area of the brain. Now, what they found in the human volunteers is there were essentially 12 different areas that they could identify within the ventrolateral frontal cortex, and each of these 12 areas had its own pattern of connections with the rest of the brain, a sort of neural fingerprint telling us that it is doing something unique. So then they took these MRI maps and they compared them to the similar maps that they got from the macaque monkeys, and it turned out that 11 of the 12 areas were very, very similar. However, there was one area that humans have that really does not have an analog at all in the macaque brain. They called this area the lateral frontal pole prefrontal cortex. Says the paper's first author, Franz Xaver Neubert, we've established an area in the human frontal cortex which does not seem to have an equivalent in the monkey at all. This area has been identified with strategic planning and decision-making as well as multitasking. The Oxford group also found that the auditory parts of the brain were much more well-connected in the human's prefrontal cortex than in the macaque. This is probably something to do with the massive necessity that humans have now to be able to both generate and understand language, which is obviously a pretty big part of being human. So next time you're walking down the street and you see a monkey, feel free to mock it for its total lack of a lateral frontal pole prefrontal cortex. And now, moving on.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Now, between this episode and the last, got a lot of interesting emails from various folks, and one of them I really wanted to share with the audience. He wrote to me with a really interesting letter about ketosis, which, we just had the ketosis episode, and this was a guy who's personally experimented with it quite a bit and had a lot to say, so I just kind of figured that this was a letter worth sharing with everybody. The author says he experimented with a ketogenic diet during the fall of 2013, just this past year, particularly for academics and studying with his performance as a rugby athlete at UC Santa Cruz, where he just graduated in molecular cellular cellular and developmental biology. He basically did a cyclical ketogenic diet from early August to late November, about 10 weeks. This is how he describes his experience. Since I'm a strong, cardiovascularly fit, and metabolically flexible 22-year-old, I had no problem getting into ketosis within 3 days of cutting carbs down to just veggies. I'd imagine for a 50-year-old who's been glucose adapted for his or her whole life, it would be a much different story, especially if they were not physically active. The first 3 days I felt focused but had a slight mental fog, which cleared up a lot after a week or so. After day 4, basically, I felt awesome, both mentally and physically. Mentally, lots of stamina, sleep was much deeper, so I felt more rested, and getting up in the morning was getting easier. The stamina, mental clarity, and focus were awesome during class time because I could focus on the lecture and what the professor was saying rather than doze off and get distracted. Coffee was instrumental in upregulating lipolysis, fat burning, and therefore increasing my ketones and thus my focus. When I was at rugby practice, I could feel my ketone bodies increase as I exercised because I felt mentally revved up. Even a tablespoon of coconut oil or MCTs would mentally rev me up. Physically, my stamina and my endurance during rugby games in the fall preseason was outstanding. However, as a tight head prop, my position on the field is primarily strength and power oriented, lots of tackling, rucking, and scrums. I don't know what that crap is, but sounds important. And thus, I truly missed the glycolytic explosiveness that carbs helped with. Long story short, during rugby games I felt very mentally sharp and never ran out of gas or bonked, but personally needed the carbs to truly do a good job on the field. I stopped the ketogenic diet during the league season in wintertime and noticed the aforementioned stamina diminish, but my power returned to what I needed. As a side note, it was hard to get hydrated. I had to supplement with some salt water every few days, as well as cook with more salt, because with low blood glucose it was hard to retain water and hence electrolytes in the kidneys. Therefore, I ended up peeing a lot of water electrolytes despite drinking a lot of water. However, supplementing with a nice Himalayan pink rock salt helped a ton with that. I thought that was pretty interesting. This letter kind of made me try a ketogenic diet for a little while on my personal list of things to do. Well, anyway, thank you very much for the email. I hope you guys enjoyed that as well. And now, a couple of other listeners to Smart Drug Smarts who reached out to me not long ago, and we decided we would have an on-air conversation. The aforementioned Mons Denton and Mike Miniman. I'm going to dive into this conversation that we just had a few days ago on the state of the nootropics world.
I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people in the nootropics industry, it's a little bit of a problem almost that their first introduction is like Limitless or some of the other media
Right.
Shows along those lines, but at the same time it does serve to kind of give somewhat of a picture of what is conceptually possible, maybe not to that extreme, but the fact that there are things that you can do to improve your cognition that may be out of the realm of pharmaceuticals or whatever the case may be.
Right, possibly not quite enough to base a movie on, but still kind of interesting.
I think one of the things that I find interesting is if you take a look at the trends, obviously there was a huge spike, when the Limitless movie came out.
Sure.
And then that kind of died off. Limitless, it's been a few years, it's sort of fading from people's memory, and yet, Limitless never used the term nootropics in the movie once, but you are seeing, the kind of Google trends for nootropics, the tide is rising for sure, kind of steadily month after month. So I do think people are getting the word out, in a number of ways that aren't through the movie. So I do think that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like looking around on a lot of nootropic, blogs and websites and stuff like that. Limitless might not have used the word nootropics, but nootropic blogs sure use the word limitless a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it a lot, even in just people who are kind of new to the concept on other forums that are not specific to nootropics. That it seems to be, kind of the introduction or even just the joke. And I don't, I think there's some good and some bad, but like Mike said, it kind of died down and it's kind of just becoming more popular naturally and organically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of, kind of body hackers and, that company, that guy out of San Francisco who came up with Soylent. I think as you see things like that gain popularity, you get sort of a halo effect. Like when iPhone sales go up, so do all of Apple's other products. And I think as you see one sort of like body hacking thing getting press, people start looking into it and they find and discover related concepts.
Yeah, I think actually probably the single biggest thing that's going to help nootropics sort of, blossom in the public awareness is the baby boomer generation getting old, because we're going to have so many more people with Alzheimer's, so many more people with senile dementia and stuff like that. And it seems like a lot of the nootropics sort of comes as like spillover benefits to the younger population from things that are originally hoped to be like neuroprotective agents for older people that are sort of, falling off the cognitive shelf.
Absolutely. And you got to remember too, I mean, the nootropics industry does feel very heavily, pointed at the kind of like 18 to 30, range. College students themselves, 18 to 21, 22, whatever, don't really have that much spending money. The baby boomers have a ton of spending money.
Sure.
And yet, a lot of the articles don't seem to be pointed at them, for all of the positive, sort of Alzheimer's, related studies, because that's really where a lot of the research is. You really don't see a lot of that in the nootropics blogs.
I think one of the things to think about is, as humans, we have this weird split that's not quite rational, where it hurts you more psychologically to like lose $50 than it makes you feel good to get $50. And we always have this, I forget what they call that. But anyway, people are willing to spend a lot more money and a lot more attention, a lot more research dollars, whatever it is, to keep from feeling stupider than they will be to gain additional intelligence that maybe they don't need anyway. It's like when you're an old person, or your father or mother or something's an old person, and you start to see them losing intelligence, that's a lot more set off alarm bells for you than thinking, I'm young, I'm in the prime of my life, but it would be nice to have 20 more IQ points.
Yeah, I think also the interesting thing is like you said, how much the research goes into Alzheimer's, and yet how little it's actually talked about on the nootropics blogs and the communities. And it's my own grandfather's evidence of it itself. He takes oxiracetam and some choline and he's typically very kind of cagey when it comes to the things that he puts in his body, just less of a health kind of perspective, and more of a just fixed in his ways kind of perspective. Mm-hmm. But as soon as we mentioned that improved memory was involved, he was on board like right away.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, all of us are young enough where it's not really probably a concern for us yet, but I mean, that's just got to be truly horrifying to think that your brain might not be all it once was, and that it's going to be getting worse instead of better. I imagine people are willing to do almost anything to avoid that.
Yeah, for sure.
So what are you guys' personal stacks like nowadays? I know, Mike, you talk about this on your blog, Smarter Nootropics, of sort of, how to design the best stack for oneself. What are your go-to chemicals?
So interestingly enough, I actually don't have sort of a consistent stack, and that's sort of a result of, companies like Pure Nootropics come out with a new product, and then, I'll review it. So I'm actually sort of, I'll spend a month on one stack, a month on another stack, just because I'm constantly trying out different stacks for review. Mm-hmm. So my shelf is sort of full of these, kind of pre-built stacks. I like the caffeine and L-theanine plus the sort of Siltep stack. I feel like that's a, really nice kind of cognitive enhancement boost, although you do get the tolerance to the caffeine for sure. Mm-hmm. I take magnesium every day to kind of help, just sort of reset any sort of, tolerance that I would be building to, caffeine or, even sort of stimulants like phenylpiracetam or, ones like that. I like phenylpiracetam a lot. I really liked coliracetam. I felt like, that was nice, was sort of a cognitive enhancement plus, as an anxiolytic. So, I like those things. And, I kind of focus a lot, on the site about, keeping stuff simple, because I do feel like people, they're like, oh my God, I read about all these things that have health benefits, and now I'm going to take 20 different things.
Yeah, and you have no idea what's actually having effects for you.
But yeah, so I mean, because I'm reviewing things, I'm really not kind of stuck to one thing. I'm sure, at some point, I'll probably have writers doing all of that, and I'll just kind of find something to stick to. But,
Till then, you're your own guinea pig.
Yep.
Cool. What about you, Mons?
Yeah, so I think I have a very similar mindset to Mike. I'm not really getting a lot of stuff to try out, but I do get a few things. Brain Stack was one of the things that I got recently that I gave a try, and I really liked it. But I don't use anything every day, and really my go-to options are just like Mike, Smart Caffeine, or that kind, the combination of L-theanine and caffeine.
Yeah, there's a
in
couple different things that are, a couple different manufacturers that are essentially making that same thing of like the 2-to-1 mix of L-theanine and caffeine.
Yeah, and I mean, I got it from Natural Stacks, so I'm like almost. It's like the Q-tip thing. I just it to me it's I call it smart caffeine rather than
Right, yeah.
The combination of it, but I mean, it works well. And the other thing is fish oil and rhodiola. Those are the two kind of others that I add in when I'm feeling a little bit fatigued, and then fish oil is just kind of a daily thing. But one strange one maybe that I am really fond of is lemon balm, and I take it in tea form. It's very useful for someone who has issues with GABA, and I know the Braverman test is kind of subjective. It's not perfect, but it kind of confirmed a lot of the things that I already knew about myself. And when I took the lemon balm tea, I really found that it calmed me and relaxed me down a lot more, which is nice. Just certain situations, it's nice. There's sometimes I'll go months without using it at all, but every once in a while it's nice to use something like that. And I think it has more of an impact on me than it does other people, just because I've kind of explored my own biochemistry a little bit.
Let me rewind back to something you just said about the Braverman test. We haven't talked about that on Smart Drug Smarts at all. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the Braverman test is it's part of a book that's entitled The Edge Effect by Eric Braverman, and it's a good book, but he's got a specific portion that's kind of a test. It's kind of true-false tests, and you can answer these different questions. And if you do it in kind of as unbiased as possible, you can develop a score that helps you determine which neurotransmitters you are dominant in or deficient in. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of controversy about any of these kinds of tests, but a lot of people in the nootropics community do find that it's somewhat valuable, and that in using that test kind of turned me on to lemon balm as a natural way of improving GABA levels. And so the test, I think there's even like PDFs online where you can find it. But he's a doctor. His resume is very impressive. And
yeah, we'll put up a link to that, definitely.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful for people who are interested in kind of getting an idea of their own biochemistry, even if it's just one of many different ways.
So what part of the lemon does lemon balm come from? Is that like the lemon's belly button or something like that?
It's actually a different plant, and it's not actually a lemon. It's in the mint family.
Wow, okay. Came to the right place. I had no idea. I've never heard of lemon balm before.
Who knows why they decided to call it that, but it's a plant that grows naturally in the Mediterranean area, and you can the lemon balm that I buy, it's quite cheap, and you can just buy the tea leaves. They're just dried leaves in the tea bags, and you just drop a bag in with some hot water. And I know a few people who actually grow their own leaves and then just kind of dry them out, crush them up, and make their own, or they just eat them. So it's a very natural method, which is not always the best, but I mean, it's pretty cool.
One of the things that you kind of reminded me of with the tea, and also kind of knowing your own biochemistry, one of the things I've been focusing on a lot is kind of like food allergies that I have, and over the past year, kind of tracking my diet, I realized that I'm fairly gluten intolerant, and having cut that out, I'm just, because I'm not bloating and whatnot, I'm able to focus a whole lot better mentally. So there's a lot to be said for, knowing your biochemistry and knowing what foods to eat, that I don't think gets said enough, kind of with the, there's a pill for everything sort of culture that we may have.
Yeah.
But, that kind of knowing your own chemistry is incredibly important.
I keep trying to bang that drum on Smart Drug Smarts that I think for most people the easiest wins and the biggest benefits are to get rid of the stuff which is probably depressing your levels of cognition before trying to amp them up a little bit by pouring some nootropics on. It's like most people are kind of semi-poisoning themselves with elements of their diet or their environment or things that they're not doing, like getting enough blood flow and exercise, and just sort of bringing yourself up to what should be your baseline level as an animal is probably where a lot of great effects can really be felt. And then once you're to that point, then start thinking about maybe building your stack.
Well, just as someone to kind of plug what you're saying, Jesse, as someone who actually sells nootropics, I even still agree with you that you can do so much more benefit to yourself if you just kind of get sleep, do the exercise, and eat right, eat the proper foods. And, you know, nootropics are really, when you're at that kind of elite level where that extra little few percent really makes a difference, you know, that's where you can see the most benefits. But yeah, the lifestyle choices are definitely some of the bigger ones.
Yeah, completely agree. One of the things, we did an episode, I don't know, maybe a month or 3 ago, about transcranial direct current stimulation. Are you guys hip to this? This is
Yep.
Okay, so pretty cool technology. But one of the things that seems really interesting about this, and I guess this shouldn't be a surprise, is that what they find is they can make certain areas of the brain work better. But there's almost, for whatever area they apply the amperage to through the skull, there's sort of like a corresponding deficiency that comes along with it. And it's almost as if our brains, given to us by biology, are kind of the best all-purpose brain that we're probably going to have access to, at least in the next couple of decades. What we're gaining the ability to do with some of these technical approaches to cosmetic neurology is to kind of say, well, you know what, if I want a little bit more focus, but maybe a little less emotional control, and I'm willing to make that trade for the next 18 hours, maybe this is the drug, or maybe this is the application of technology. And I think what we're going to have access to now is some ability to make some sort of seesaw choices, like not have the best all-purpose brain necessarily, but make short-term trade-offs and say, I'll trade you a little bit of this for a little bit of that with our own cognition.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I talk about with Justin, who's my partner on Smarter Nootropics. Really, kind of the thing that it comes down to is there's not really a free lunch. Kind of with anything, certainly some of the nootropics have very few kind of side effects or come down, but generally there's a tolerance, as you play around with neurotransmitter levels. Your brain does want to come back to sort of a homeostasis. So, a lot of things do become, less effective over time, or, you have a come down or something. So you got to be kind of cognizant of, what those trade-offs are.
Yeah, I forget who said it, but I love this quote. It was one of the best one-liners that's come out of the podcast so far, is that equilibrium will not be denied. And this was somebody talking about how, pretty much anything you can do to temporarily jack some part of your brain or body, there's always the corresponding, other side of the sine curve. But then again, I mean, there's some things like, creatine and how it tends to increase, the development of capillaries and blood flow to the brain. It's like, it's hard to think that there's anything bad, there's any corresponding downside to maybe having some additional capillaries and some additional oxygen that's available to your brain.
That's certainly true. And one of the things, that kind of as we research into these things, like, for example, if you take a look at some of the NGF promoting agents like lion's mane, or you take a look at, 5-HTP, it's like, yes, it's very positive on the brain, but sometimes, in other areas of the body, it does have a negative. And with creatine, I know it's fairly well studied, and it does seem to be good for both the body and the brain. So I can't really speak, to a negative on that one.
Yeah.
But, it's some of the things perhaps, as we get more targeted, we'll get better. But I do still highly recommend everybody kind of, take a look into, what are any known trade-offs at least.
I tell you, it's like if offered that trade, and if it was something that I really believed the research behind, like you can do this and it'll benefit your brain, but it's going to hurt some aspect of your body. Honestly, I would take that trade all day long. As like a guy in my 30s with the pace of medical technology, and they're making human organs in pigs that can be swapped in later. It's just like I think my brain I want to enhance and protect at all costs. But to a large extent, I feel like our bodies are going to be replaceable machine parts very soon.
I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that one.
Yeah, I mean that's a hell of a trade.
Ticket to immortality.
Yeah.
My body's at like age 50 right now, so I'd prefer to get some machinery going as well.
Mons is a young guy. He's not doing himself justice.
Well, I'm 23, but my legs and hips and every kind of joint has probably gone through about 40 years worth of movement. I had like hip surgery. I've had all kinds of injuries.
Were you one of these high school football players or something like that?
High school, and then also I played after high school soccer. So they're contact sports and lots of running do not equate to a very friendly, end of your career, no matter how old you are.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. We've had a couple of people on the show that have kind of gone into fairly impassioned speeches against youth sports that have, any likelihood of brain injury, which, there's a lot of brain injuries that don't get noticed necessarily at the time. Like, oh, this kid got a concussion playing football, and think, oh, well, that's kind of par for the course. That's what kids do. But some people are like, no, that's a really, really big deal. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when it comes to soccer, one of the things my mom, maybe unfounded, but she was always like trying to convince me not to head the ball. Mm-hmm. And it's just impossible when you're playing high level sports to just completely not use your head. Right. But there are, I don't know how many studies there are, but there's some evidence to suggest that each, one of those headers can do some damage to brain cells and things. But on the other side of the spectrum, there's a lot of the same chemicals that are in the brain after concussions are also in the brain after you are lacking sleep. And, so I think it really can be a problem, especially if you're forcing kids to be in certain situations. With soccer, I don't see it as being too much of an issue, just because it is a contact sport. There is the chance of hurting your head, but in general, you can gauge yourself without a helmet on. In football, it's a little bit of a different story, because football,
other people are going to be running into you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, that's true. But that happens in soccer as well. The only difference is football, you have a false sense of security with the helmet, and in reality, you can get a concussion from being hit in the chest or any other part of the body hard enough that jars your head. Mm-hmm. And so the pads and the helmet, it really provides kind of a false sense of security that can be even more problematic than other contact sports.
Great answer.
I'm biased, I play soccer. So.
Well, yeah, but you're also a Nootropics guy, so you kind of have one foot in both camps or something like that now.
I was doing biofeedback for a while in high school, full on kind of neurofeedback, and I went skiing and I had a really nasty concussion actually, which, complete amnesia,
wow.
Short and long-term memory loss. But I recovered from it pretty quickly, and I think the biofeedback helped with that, because I was able to kind of, target some of the areas and, figure out kind of where the damage had been and work on those things.
Is that kind of what got you started down this path of being a brain-interested person?
I think being diagnosed with ADHD at a young age, having had kind of Adderall in middle school and, and just also, generally kind of wanting to, always get, every last drop of performance out.
Tell us a little bit about Adderall, since you've had firsthand experience with it. We did an Adderall episode a few weeks ago, but even the doctor who had prescribed it was not a user.
It's a kick in the ass for sure. It's kind of, you sit down and, you get like 6 to 8 hours of pretty high focus, and then you're just shot for the rest of the day. And, once like the nice kind of dopamine rush wears off, you just kind of left kind of anxious, and, it's hard to sleep, and, I don't know, a lot of really negatives kind of after the drug wears off. That don't really get, kind of replaced by one night's sleep. You really need like 3 or 4 days off of it, I think, before you come back to normal functioning levels.
Now, for people that have Adderall as a prescription for ADHD, I mean, are they really taking days off of it, or is it more or less an everyday thing, or at least on school days or whatever?
So, I mean, it's kind of different with every person and their doctor. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people, kids in school will take it, Monday to Friday and then go off on the weekends.
Yeah.
But a lot of kids, the parents are like, oh, the doctor said to take this, they gave us 30 pills for 30 days, so, take it every day. And I think that's bad. I do think, that you need as much kind of time off as possible. I think for people, who are, higher functioning, ADD, ADHD, you can kind of sense, in the morning if you're going to be having a good day or a bad day, just kind of by how scattered your brain is in the morning. And I think, if people were to use it kind of only as needed, once or twice a week, I think that's, sort of fairly sustainable.
Yeah.
But I think once you get kind of past that and you don't have, like a number of rest days off of it, that, tolerance goes up and kids start off at 5 and they wind up at, 30 milligrams a day. And I really don't think that that's healthy.
And it's also an addictive drug, so it's probably, harder to just say, well, I'm going to take the next 3 or 4 days off once you build up an addiction.
Right, and I think part of it is addictive because it's like, I was functioning very well when I was on the drug, and now that I'm off, I'm not functioning at the same level.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
So it's, it's addictive, not necessarily for kind of the, feelings of euphoria or whatever, because I think those wear off pretty quickly, even after, the second day or whatever. After a long break, the first day could feel euphoric, but the day after that, you're not getting those kind of like really good feelings. I think it's addictive a lot more just due to the, I was functioning, I was getting good grades, and now I'm not,
Totally. Yeah, that's a great distinction to make between sort of the physiological addiction and just the, how you feel psychological component to it.
That psychological thing is huge.
It's huge.
A friend of mine and I were actually talking about it earlier today because I typically don't drink coffee. I only drink it before I go to the gym or go work out or something. And I've noticed over the past year since I've actually been drinking coffee that my taste for it has actually improved. I used to think it was just terrible. Black coffee was terrible, and there may be some kind of acquired taste to it, but I think also there's that psychological fact that every time I drink the coffee, something good happens, and that psychological connection, it just makes it a little bit more pleasant, and it's really powerful.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things that I think most people can understand and sympathize with because they've felt it themselves about coffee is that whole idea of perking up when you smell coffee. And of course, that is 100% placebo driven, because even from the time you gulp coffee, it has to be in your stomach for like 15-20 minutes before the caffeine makes it to your bloodstream and is having direct physiological effects. But once you've been drinking coffee for weeks, months, years, whatever it is, just the smell of it, like you're going to be perkier in 20 to 30 minutes. And so the placebo effect kind of does the work for you.
Yeah, and something we should mention about the placebo effect is the placebo effect, doesn't mean that nothing's happening. It is very real.
Oh, absolutely.
They did a study with people, cocaine users, and they, put cocaine users, they, I guess, give them a line or whatever, and then put them in an MRI machine and measured the, activation in different areas of the brain. And then they had users, not actually take cocaine, but go in and think about taking cocaine, and the same areas of the brain lit up. So there is actually a rush that you get, when you smell coffee. The neurotransmitters do sort of dump, I guess in anticipation, but it does actually, release those same neurotransmitters even without the chemical.
Yeah. I mean, just because something develops a placebo response doesn't mean that there isn't something real going on, and it doesn't mean that the placebo isn't also 100% real. We had a placebo episode I'll throw up the link to, but there's some really interesting science and studies that have gone on with that, and on how people will develop a placebo response pretty consistently to almost anything if it's applied with enough regularity and has real effects. I think the most striking example was with, what was it? It was like morphine or opium or something like that, where if you give people, it was like a anti-pain morphine thing. But if you give people a morphine for like 5 or 6 days in a row and then give them a placebo on day 6 or 7, whatever it is, there will absolutely be a giant physiological response to the placebo effect in like 99.9% of people, which is real and which does reduce pain. It's like, you could, whatever it is that they were receiving the pain from, that pain will drop off very consistently.
Yeah, and where that kind of comes into play is like people complain a lot about marketing in supplements and how that actually in some senses improves that placebo effect. If you have good marketing and someone buys something, that they're going to think it works better than it may, and they'll have better results. So it gets kind of hairy, but honestly, if you can get a benefit from something, it's a real benefit, like we all just said.
Yeah.
And sometimes you got to take those easy wins.
Yeah, I mean, really, there's no reason not to layer some placebo effects on top of, hopefully some real physiological effects. It's like it's kind of like you said, it's a free win, or like you can't build up a tolerance to placebo. You can't get addicted to placebo. You can't have your heart go bad at age 50 because you've taken too much placebo in your youth.
Yeah, I almost wish someone would have just sold me some sugar pills, and I'd just been using that and felt like it was my magic pill for the past few years. That would have been a lot more efficient.
Well, processed sugar is not very good for you, Mons.
in 1 gram increments, I may be okay.
Right, that's probably true.
But the interesting thing is, like, everybody's kind of a little bit wary when it comes to like the racetams and some of the more, I don't want to say intense, but the kind of more research oriented compounds. But like, when it gets to alpha brain and brain stack and cerebral success, all these pre-made stacks, it's interesting to see whether or not there's going to be any of the problems that kind of hit the supplement industry, which was like, very reputable companies providing products that had questionable ingredients in them. Like there's some companies I remember that had like methamphetamine type analogs, or they had like some contamination problems with pre-workouts and things like that. So it's interesting. I don't know. I don't know what kind. I know the Nootropics subreddit does a lot of testing, and I'm sure they'll get around to testing some of the pre-made stacks. But it's just an interesting thing to think about given what's already happened in the supplement industry.
I know that everybody I know who was into bodybuilding and took craze said that it was the sort of best pre-workout they'd ever had. And, I think in the end we found out why.
Yeah, but business, I don't know, bringing these nootropics to the masses is it's an interesting subject for the industry, because I think it, in one sense, it kind of points towards people's desire to have like a magic pill. I don't know, a lot of these unique stacks, they kind of, well, magic pill makes it sound bad, but I mean, they kind of try and target everything. They kind of, and that's oftentimes something that doesn't really always make much sense.
It's also interesting, people's sort of proclivity to, there are people who will go out and they'll take, paracetam or phenylparacetam or, some, brand new drug that's been thought up. And these are the same people who like wouldn't take any recreational drugs, which I find sort of interesting, in that, there's sort of this like, oh, well, this isn't really researched and we don't really know what its effects are, but it's not one of those, like bad drugs.
Right. Yeah, which is kind of really weird when you think about it, because there are drugs that, while illegal and while probably not good for you, have at least been around for, like, well, in some case, like, for something like psilocybin, that's been around for thousands of years. It's like, if it was going to make you drop dead, we'd know about it by now. Whereas, the newest like modafinil analog that's coming out of some, Chinese chemical plant that's, chemically similar, so it probably doesn't, make you sprout horns or anything like that. It's like, it's been around for 6 months. It's been around for 18 months. It's like, we don't really know what it does.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting subject, because for someone who's, this is a little more philosophical, but you try and think about everything like a tool, and everything can be a tool if used properly. Obviously, there's a lot of studies that show the uses of like MDMA for post-traumatic stress and things like that.
Sure.
And so it is very interesting to see how people rationalize using one thing over the other, but there's certain weird legalities involved.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that there's like the issue of legality is so tied up with sort of morality in the public consciousness in a way that isn't always rational at all. And like, this has been declared to be an illegal drug, on the law books for whatever reason. Suddenly there becomes like moral judgments associated with the use of a chemical. And a chemical really shouldn't, chemicals have no morality. It's like, something, mustard gas is a bad chemical and fish oil is a good chemical. It's like, really, they're not good. They just have certain effects on our body.
That's a great perspective to think about. Yeah.
I think that goes to marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, the thing with the public's perception of marketing, like, it just needs to be remembered that, there's financial interests, invested stakeholders in all these things. Had a really interesting talk with a guy named Professor David Nutt a few episodes ago, and he pointed out that the big push against MDMA in the 90s and 2000s in the UK, and this might be true in the US as well, I don't know, was almost entirely funded by the alcohol industry. And, you think about that like, oh, why is the alcohol industry doing such nice things to protect our, 19-year-old ravers? Well, I mean, really, it's the alcohol industry wanting to maintain a legal monopoly on intoxication.
It's the same thing with marijuana. Some of the initial push to remove, or make marijuana illegal was the paper industry with hemp.
Right.
And they did a very good job of kind of covering that with, racist overtones with Mexicans bringing marijuana and things like that. But in reality, it was hemp that was illegal before marijuana. I'm almost positive on that. Could be wrong.
Yeah, there's some really interesting documentaries around that issue on how hemp was kind of like demonized, and then all of a sudden when we needed it for production for World War II, there was like all these grow as much hemp as you can, farmers, and then as soon as World War II was over, it became illegal again, and there was some new charade as to why it was a bad thing for society. So here's a topic I'd like to kick around with you guys. Is right now I feel like we're in this time with nootropics is something that's a small percentage of society is aware of, and it's kind of like the nerdy crowd who's interested in we're on a fringe. I mean, this is not a general public thing, and I feel like that's probably there's some analogy to how maybe organic food was in the mid 1990s, and it's gonna catch on, and it's we sort of see that there's going to be a rising tide. More people are going to find out about it. There are beneficial effects that people are going to say, what, I should be doing that. And it's kind of going to get watered down and become like the Flintstones vitamin version of nootropics. Do you kind of think we're on a similar trajectory?
It's hard to tell at this point. I think part of that is going to be, people like you, Jesse, and I, who kind of are the gatekeepers, I guess, the information sources, and kind of calling out people's, BS. I think there's, if you look, there's always, on Amazon, there's like 3 new nootropic stack supplement companies that have popped up like every day,
Yeah.
It's hard to keep up. And, a lot of them are all, pretty much, the exact same formula, plus or minus a different ingredient. And then you have people, who kind of, because it's the supplement industry and because you don't actually have to prove your health benefits, you have people kind of consistently coming out and claiming that X, Y, or Z is good for you and produces memory, but there's no actual peer-reviewed studies on it. So I do think that's sort of a huge danger with it being kind of in the supplement industry and due to the legal framework, at least in the United States, that surrounds it. Because you can't technically sell paracetam for consumption as a nootropic in the US. Whereas you can take anything, you could take dirt and sell it and claim that it's good for you and going to, enhance your memory, and that would be okay. I think part of the problem is the legal framework that really opens up, a lot of it for kind of snake oil and also kind of helps keep the pharmaceutical companies keep their monopoly. But part of the issue with the pharmaceuticals is, unless a drug is kind of like targets a specific problem, right? And then gets prescribed by a doctor, you're not really going to take something that actually, solves a problem that doesn't really exist. Like you don't see pharmaceuticals out there to take you from, normal functioning to higher functioning. You only see pharmaceuticals out there that have been approved for taking somebody who's functioning at below baseline and taking them up to baseline. So it's really sort of this weird legal, kind of gray area that we've created as a society where it's almost, kind of anything that you take that enhances you is, either gray or illegal.
Okay, well, thank you very much to both Mike and Mons for joining me for that conversation. I just actually re-listened to that after hearing the first edit of it and found myself taking a bunch of notes. I mean, there's a lot of stuff there I'd like to revisit in future episodes, maybe dive deeply on some of these things that were dropped as quick little conversation kernels, but a lot of valuable insights there, and we'll be putting up links to a bevy of stuff on the show notes for this episode. And now, as promised, the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
All right, so we're going to actually kind of read a passage from a book for this ruthless listener retention gimmick. This was sent to me as an excerpt from Daily Rituals, How Artists Work, and the artist in question, well, a mathematician, but he made his way into this book on artists because he was such an interesting guy. It was Paul Erdős, who was born in 1913, died in 1996. He was one of the most brilliant and prolific mathematicians of the 20th century, and he was also, as Paul Hoffman documents in his book, The Man Who Loved Only Numbers, a true eccentric, a mathematical monk who lived out of a pair of suitcases. He dressed only in tattered suits and gave away almost all the money that he earned, keeping just enough to sustain his meager lifestyle. He was a hopeless bachelor who was extremely devoted to his mother and never learned to cook or even boil his own water for tea, and also a fanatic workaholic who put in 19-hour days, sleeping only a couple of hours a night. Now, Erdős owed his physical stamina to amphetamines. He took 10 to 20 milligrams of Benzedrine or Ritalin daily. Worried about his drug use, a friend once bet Erdős that he wouldn't be able to give up amphetamines for a month. Erdős took the bet and succeeded in going cold turkey for 30 days. When he came to collect his money, he told the friend, "You showed me that I'm not an addict, but I didn't get any work done. I'd get up in the morning and just stare at a blank piece of paper. I have no ideas, just like an ordinary person. You've set mathematics back a month." After the bet, Erdős promptly resumed his amphetamine habit, which he supplemented with shots of strong espresso and caffeine tablets. A mathematician, he liked to say, is a machine for turning coffee into theorems. So while I don't think we'd necessarily recommend emulating everything about Paul Erdős in the Smart Drug Smarts podcast, definitely an interesting guy and somebody that I thought would be worth throwing up on your radar screen. Again, that book is The Man Who Loved Only Numbers, and the reference was from Daily Rituals, How Artists Work. You heard it, that is the episode. If you liked what you heard on this 40th episode, please recommend this podcast to your friends and or leave us a review on iTunes. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to all the bevy of stuff that we talked about here. I think I said bevy twice this episode. I need to get myself a thesaurus. And I will be back with a thesaurus at the same time next week on the same podcast and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.